And of course, we know the story of the native peoples here, the Narragansett, the Wampanoags, the Nipmucks, the Niantics, the Pickwas, and all the other native tribes. We know their story, don't we? Of course we do, because the history books tell us that when the English settlers came here, they brought with them epidemics, and there was a vicious, nasty war, and more epidemics, and wiped clean the landscape of the native peoples here. That's what the history books say. Matter of fact, in 1822, the Secretary of War received a report on Indian affairs that stated that the Indian communities in New England were just a few feeble remnants teetering on the brink of extinction. That's what the history books tell us. Well, my friends, I'm going to suggest to you that the history books are wrong. They don't tell us the story of the native peoples here. And it's a much larger story and one we need to know about. And I want you to focus on one concept. He who writes the history controls the history. You're probably wondering why I have two rangers in national park service sitting in the middle of the woods with books. We have to remember, we're readers of history. We're looking for new ideas, new concepts, new ways of understanding. And sometimes sitting out here with Mother Nature is the best way to come to those revelations. Now, I'm with my good friend and ranger colleague, Dan Maharg, and Dan has been doing some research here on the communities in the Blackstone Valley and how they treated or listed the natives, the Native Americans here. Dan, what have you come up with?
Well, I got out of our park library 3 county histories, or 3 local histories. This is the history of Worcester County, written in 1879. This is history of Grafton, also written in the 19th century. And this is a 20th century history, history of Upton. And so I just looked in there for you, Chuck. I looked up Nipmuc people and wanted to see what they said. So this is Frederick Pierce's book from 1879, A History of Grafton. And in here he says that the Nipmuc people over the last 2 centuries have vanished. So totally disappeared, according to Frederick Pierce. But I was looking at a census that was done in 1992 that said that living in Worcester County now, there are 1,400 Nipmuc people. So I was a little surprised. Why does it say they vanished here? And yet nowadays we have 1,400.
That's even more amazing when you consider the town of Grafton has the Nipmuc Reservation there that has in Minisko.
Right.
And that is a centerpiece of Nipmuc culture. It has been for decades, centuries.
Right.
So why would they say that those people no longer existed?
Well, that's a tough question because, like you said, Frederick Pierce obviously knew his neighbors, and he knew the people living at the reservation there. And why he decided to not call them Nipmuc people is really interesting. I think it has something to do with Frederick Pierce and other people's attitude at that time, the 19th century, their attitude about what an Indian was. And for them, what an Indian was somebody who lived out in the forest, who lived maybe in a little teepee or a wetu someplace, who mainly lived by hunting or making baskets. And as he looked around at his neighbors at Hassanamisco, he saw them as barbers, stone workers, factory workers, shoemakers, and he said, well, these people aren't living the way I think Indians live, so therefore I'm not going to call them Indians. I'm just going to assume that they've vanished. And I think that's why in these local histories you don't find descriptions of native people as they're living, as shoemakers. They're not being described as native and factory workers.
Because that would go against our romanticized view of the Indian.
Right, they're not living in the forest, so therefore they're not Indian according to these folks.
It must be very difficult for people to overcome that kind of stereotype. The only way you can be an Indian or Indianness would be out in the woods. Or how are you going to make a living and fit into society?
Right, so for Nipmuc people, this must have been particularly a difficult time to live, because here you have a bunch of people in the dominant culture, the white culture, let's say, saying, you've all vanished. You're no longer Nipmuc people. And you have Nipmuc people saying, well, I consider myself a Nipmuc person. I have a family heritage, I have a set of beliefs, and I have a community that I live with that for me is distinctly Nipmuc. At the same time, you have the white culture saying, no, you're shoemakers now. And more importantly, you're a person of color. You're no longer a Nipmuc person. And that shows through in these county histories and also in the census records at the time. You find a person described in the 1860 census as an Indian. In the 1870 census, they're described as a person of color or a colored person. Same person, but the census taker, as part of the white dominant society, decides that this person is no longer Nipmuc.